Hi everyone, I'm Mallory. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Civic Engagement and Advocacy Manager for Kaleidoscope Youth Center.
And I'm Dee. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm the Ohio GSA Network Manager at KYC.
It has been a while since we've recorded an episode. I feel like the year started off and I was ready to hit the ground running, and unfortunately so was the Ohio legislature. And so I've gotten caught up in some other things, but we're so excited to have our guest on today. I think this is somebody who a lot of folks you're definitely gonna learn something from, but maybe be inspired by as well. So I'm very excited to introduce this next guest. Today we have Svetlana Harlan, who uses she, her pronouns, and she's coming to us from the Ohio History Connection. And before you fall asleep, because you're like, oh God, state history, whatever, I'm here to tell you that I'm going to change your mind. So Take it away. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Queering history,
Ooh.
Yes. My name is Svetlana Harlan, she, her pronouns. So my role at the Ohio History Center, or Ohio History Connection, is I am the project coordinator for the Gay Ohio History Initiative, and we use the acronym GOHI. So that has been part of Ohio History Connection since 2006. In the aftermath of the Defense Against Marriage Act in the mid-2000s, there were a group of folks here in central Ohio who came together and wanted to have some sort of way of preserving queer history, because unfortunately a lot of it wasn't housed in kind of like the traditional archives and libraries that a lot of historical documents tend to be housed in. And a lot of documents from like the 80s and the early 90s and even before were falling into bad conditions. Some of them were being tossed out, thrown away, and there's a lot of really rich history in those documents. So in 2006, Ohio Historical Society at the time, now Ohio History Connection, joined forces with a coalition of folks from around central Ohio, including some folks from Stonewall and other organizations that are slipping my mind currently, but it was several folks within the coalition that came together to make GOHI. And it was really meant to be a community-based historic preservation project. And so over the last couple decades, it's almost been 20 years now.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, almost.
When you said 2006, I was like, okay, right?
Yeah.
20 years. You are not wrong. That's 18 years ago.
It is, yeah. So that is an adult. That is an adult person. So for the last 18 years, we've really focused on collections and growing the collection. We have a pretty robust collection of manuscripts, which are made up of documents, publications, journals, zines, all kinds of things that have been published by the LGBTQ+ community from all around Ohio, not just from central Ohio. We also have museum objects, some of which have been in our museum collection and exhibits at the Ohio History Center. We would like to eventually have a LGBTQ+ exhibit at Ohio History Center. And so that's something that we're working towards, and it probably won't be for a few years because these things take a really long time to organize, but that's kind of like a long-term thing that we're working on. And what other things are we doing? Oh yes, of course. So currently we're actually really working towards community engagement and outreach since we've been working on collections for such a long time. And we're in the second year of a 3-year project currently called Marking Diverse Ohio. And the main objective of this project is to create 10 new Ohio historical markers around the state that tell LGBTQ+ stories. So a little background on the Historical Markers Program. It is one of the oldest programs that we have, dating back to the 1950s. And around the state, there are nearly 1,800 Ohio historical markers that tell all sorts of stories, all sorts of histories. And they've always been community focused and proposed by community members. So it's really like a grassroots way to tell stories and preserve history. And people take a lot of pride in these markers. So we've only got 3 markers that tell LGBTQ+ stories currently. One in Dayton that went up in 2009, one in Cleveland went up in 2017, and the latest one actually went up here in Columbus last year for the Summit Station Lesbian Bar, which some of you may be familiar with. So it was a really amazing event to go to. I was there, I was present, and I could really feel that positive energy, and it kind of energized me to continue doing this work. So the hope is that we will have 10 new markers that tell LGBTQ stories, and that we will have all of these sort of dedications and celebrations around these markers, and there'll be a way for folks to not only learn about their history, but to have a place to come and see it physically and celebrate. I think that's really important. So yeah, that's kind of the basics of what I'm doing. I will say in that role, I've gotten to use a lot of my like historical research experience, because that's where I come from. I come from academic history. And so what I do is I travel around the state, and I get to meet people from all over and hear their stories and connect with them. And then I offer my services as a historian. I am able to help them find resources and historical documents that help support the stories, because ultimately that's been one of the major obstacles for creating historical markers, is not having those resources that tell the story. So we help to preserve those, potentially housing them or helping to digitize them. We record oral histories with folks, which is a really big part of the work we're doing to help preserve history, especially when there's not like documents. And then we write an application essentially, which includes a historical statement, the who, what, where, when, why, all of the big historical questions. And we also work on the marker text and some of the like logistic things like getting property rights and maintenance organizations involved. So there's a lot of like history going on, but there's also a lot of like logistical and community engagement stuff that I'm having to learn on the job, because that's not my background. So it's been a real learning experience. But honestly, it's been a real privilege. I've gotten to meet some really amazing people, and I've gotten to connect with the older generation of queer folks, which I think a lot of times get kind of left out or forgotten about. And hearing their stories has just honestly been really amazing. And I'm having a great time at the job. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really fun. Sometimes I'm like, wow, this is my job. This is so cool. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about like my background and how I got here if you're interested.
Yeah, I'm really curious. And like when you like decided that, you wanted to go into history and all of that, were you thinking specifically like queer history? Was there like a certain avenue, or did like you just happen to stumble upon what sounds to me like a super awesome job?
Wow. So it's a kind of a long journey to get here. As an undergrad, I grew up in Kentucky. Well, I was born in the country of Armenia, and when I was 4 years old, we moved to Kentucky, and that's where I grew up. I always really enjoyed history as my favorite subject in school, and I majored in history and social studies, and originally I thought I would be a K-12 teacher, because like, what are you going to do with history, right, other than teach? That's the narrative, right? So I did that for about a year, and it was in a public school system in Southern Kentucky. And it was definitely not the most like inclusive, welcoming environment. And I also was like, I really love history. I'm like less into schools. So I ended up going back to my same undergrad institution, which was Western Kentucky University. Shout out to Big Red, the Hilltoppers. Woo woo. But anyway, yeah, I went back, and it was a lot of the same professors, but like it was really a different level of what we were doing. It was a lot of like jumping into primary sources, which are like historical documents, and interpreting them and kind of synthesizing that into some sort of like argument or analysis, essentially, which was like much different than like undergrad, like reading and remembering dates. And I really fell in love with it and wanted to be a professor. So I got everything together to apply for a PhD program. I actually applied to like 8 programs, and I got into OSU, which was my top one out of the ones that I applied for, because there were some really cool professors that I wanted to work with. They actually have a really strong, just more background. I was focusing on Russian history, which is some of my background. I'm Russian and Armenian, and I speak Russian. So I was like, hey, like that's cool. I didn't know yet at that time like what themes I would be exploring. I knew that I was interested in LGBTQ+ history, but I didn't know if it was like a realistic holistic research project, because there's always like the question of sources and whether or not you're going to be able to actually do the research you need to do to write a dissertation. But so yeah, I ended up getting into OSU and started working on a dissertation about sexuality in the Soviet Union, particularly in the end of the Soviet Union, which was like right where there was like some efforts to reform. It was a time called Perestroika. So there was some more freedom, and it was kind of like this interesting period that was really different than what came before and what came after. And so one of the chapters that I did was specifically about the nascent sort of LGBTQ plus community that was taking shape during that time. And I got to go to Russia for about a year.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a privilege. It was very cool. I got a grant to do that, and I met some really amazing people. I ended up not having a great living situation when I first got there. I first arrived there in 2018 during the World Cup and could not find a place to live that was affordable. And so I reached out to some folks that I knew on Facebook and found some random people, and they're like, "Come live with us." Like it's cool. It was this community of like of queer women in Russia. Yeah,
This is like a movie.
it's very cool. It was very cool. I'm downplaying it, honestly. It was even cooler. And they like all lived in a cool house together, and well, some of them lived there, some of them just almost lived there. It's weird. And they were like in their late 20s, early 30s, which if you're like an unmarried woman in Russia in your 30s, like you are a social pariah, basically. So it was an interesting vibe. Honestly, like they made my time there so much better than I otherwise would have, because it would have been very lonely without them. And in fact, one of the people that lived there was, well, the person whose house it was. She was really amazing and did a lot of like very cool things like for queer people in Russia specifically, because it's a it's a tough time for them there. It's only gotten worse in the last few years, but a lot of persecution. A lot of people have left Russia who are queer. So, she was doing a lot of really cool things to support the community. So yeah, I lived with them, did research. There was a archive that was like a private archive that was ran out of somebody's house, where it was like all of the queer sources were there. Wow. And it was very cool. In order to get in, I had to have a telephone call with the owner, and she like screened me. She was like, "Who do you know?
Right.
Who have you read?" Like she was like, "Okay, you don't seem like a spy. Like you seem like."
Oh my gosh.
It was nuts. Yeah. And
So is that like common knowledge that archive exists there, or like how did you find out about this person's house? Because I imagine it's not just like GOHI that you could do a quick Google search and find it.
So I read a lot of the literature of other historians who had been doing this kind of research similarly. And so there are a few that were also doing research on queer Russia, different time periods than me, but still same subject. And so they have citations, and the citations were where I found this archive, and a lot of times they would thank the owner, whose name was Elena. I mean, hopefully it still is Elena. I worry about them all the time though, because they're not in a great spot, and they can't necessarily move the collection without it being confiscated. So I do worry about that collection a lot. So essentially, it was like through the grapevine of history that I learned about this collection, and then ultimately with the screening phone call, I was able to I guess prove that I knew enough about history that it seemed legit. And also the fact that my Russian was not amazing, because as a heritage speaker who mostly grew up speaking English, she's like, okay, if you were going to be a Russian spy, you might speak better Russian. So it was super cool. This all happened right around the pandemic. And I ended up having to leave early for my research here in March of 2020.
Wow.
And honestly, because of that collection, she actually allowed me to basically transfer all of the digitized files onto my hard drive.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a real privilege. Yeah, she actually just asked that I not publish them anywhere, and I was like, yeah, absolutely, I won't do that.
Wow.
And because of that, I was able to write my dissertation, whereas otherwise I probably would not have been able to finish. Yeah, so it was very cool. I really loved that whole adventure. It was very challenging on a personal level because I was coming face to face with like the human rights abuses of a country that I have like a heritage from, where I still have family in. It was really like personal and kind of tough at times for sure. But it was also really cool to see all of the ways that queer people in Russia were still like thriving and had community and like were taking care of each other. And that made me, that was really touching. And I think that's kind of where I started to feel drawn to like community-based history and like local stories and working with individuals, which is kind of what I do now. I think that's really where that started.
As you're talking about this and you're talking about how like, the oppression of queer people in Russia, but also like here in Ohio, I think the juxtaposition between seeing what the legislature is trying to pass and is passing against queer and trans people here in Ohio, and then hearing that there's the Ohio History Connection, like that is a state entity. This isn't just a group of people who are doing this on their own, you know what I mean? This is like a state-funded thing that has this investment in telling queer stories. And I think, you're out in the community, you're talking to these people who experience these stories firsthand or who are working together to get these stories told. And like, it just goes to show that I'm sure that the vast majority of Ohioans are supportive of queer and trans people, and it's the legislature is not, what they're doing is not indicative of the will of the people, but you get to see that firsthand too.
Yeah, for sure. I think that speaking to that, I think first of all it's really important that we're preserving and sharing this history, because there's this notion that queer people, especially trans and gender nonconforming people, are like a new thing, which is really, if you pay attention to the history, especially like pre-modern history, like pre-20th century history, you actually see that gender nonconforming people have been around in some form in most cultures. And that also applies to like the cultures that feed in to make America, whether we're talking about Native cultures or European cultures or cultures from all over the world. So there's a very rich and long history of queer people existing, being part of larger society, contributing. So, I think it's important to dispel the narrative that queerness is new and it's infiltrating and, it's like a threat that is growing. If anything, we may live in a time where like it is just easier to be queer. I mean, I hope that continues to be the case, and there's like language to use that people can describe their identities and the way they feel about their gender and their sexuality more openly. And if anything, I think that's a positive thing and something that I think that came from like recognizing the historical sort of path that queer people have been on and continue to be on, So that was kind of like a long way of saying like queer people are here, they've been here, and we have the documents to prove it. So as far as like OHC is technically it's a nonprofit that is not technically part of the state. So although we do
stand corrected, so that makes a little bit more sense.
It gives us a little bit more room to kind of like pursue projects that are not necessarily at the state's behest. We do receive like a substantial portion of our funding from the state, but ultimately we're independent and we set our own initiatives. So that's great.
So with that then, like, have you received any pushback from any state, like government officials or like from anybody for pursuing this 10-year or this 3-year project to put 10 historical markers up? Has anyone questioned the decision to do that or thought that it wasn't important, or have people been really accepting of it?
I haven't encountered anything, any pushback from anyone at the official level. We've encountered, unfortunately, some folks that are just like, don't think what we're doing is important, and they let us know on social media or, we've approached some folks about potentially collaborating on markers or like, hey, we have this idea, but we need a space. And, them not being open to that, which is totally their prerogative. Thankfully, we haven't encountered any sort of like official like complaints or anything, and that may change as our project becomes more public and we start to actually have markers going into the ground. And some of these markers are going to be in like less urban areas and hopefully more like smaller towns and rural areas. So the hope is that they'll be all over the state.
Right.
Some, of course, in like the bigger cities like Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, but also some in smaller towns and more rural areas. So, you know, we're also kind of challenging the narrative that queer people aren't there. They are, and they have really awesome histories that we're going to share with folks. And I think that there's always going to be some pushback and some, unfortunately, some folks that are not happy about that. Thankfully, we haven't encountered any like I can't say that word, legislative pushback or anything that I know of. You know, I'm kind of on the ground floor, so I'm not always privy to like all of the top level stuff, but I think I would know if someone was like, hey, stop what you're doing.
Right.
We don't like it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, unfortunately, I'm always very pessimistic as far as you know, I obviously like to have hope that everything is going to be like well received, but as it relates to like the government, I'm always kind of skeptical that they're going to be supportive, or at least like, you know, at least supportive, if not like directly attacking these efforts. So
Right.
it's really cool to see that, like, you know, while Ohio especially recently has been getting a lot of bad attention for as it relates to LGBTQIA plus identities, like there are these points of recognition, and like you're right, people don't just exist like here in Columbus, it's everywhere, right? We know these things. Actually have that physical recognition is very cool.
Yeah, and we're also trying to make sure that this project and that GOHI in general is really rooted in the community. As part of the project, we are convening something called a community of practice, which is really part of this larger kind of like community engagement methodology called asset-based community development, ABCD. And so as part of that, we've got right now 11 folks from all around the state that are part of our community of practice that help guide GOHI and its current projects and its future projects, and ultimately kind of helping us to be accountable and also helping to steer our work, because we are just a few people that are passionate about LGBTQ plus history, but we also only have our own experiences, and you know, the LGBTQ plus community is diverse, and we want to make sure that we are doing our best to represent all of the people. So having that community of practice has been really amazing, and it's been a great way of like getting direct community feedback for what we're doing.
Wow.
That's awesome. Now I'm thinking like once all those markers go up, I want to do like a little tour of like, you know, like, I mean, I know the state, I've lived here my whole life, but like to be able to go to like, you know, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, but then also out and like take me to a city I've never gone to before.
When I think of like historical documents and like things that are worthy of being preserved, I think of like journals and pictures, but I imagine there's a lot more to this collection than just that. Not to say just that, but like, what are your favorite items in the collection that GOHI has?
Yeah, so a lot of our documents are, I would say maybe 60 or 70% are pertaining to like Central Ohio, and I think that's because that's where we're located, and that's where a lot of the initial coalition members were also located, so it makes a lot of sense that we're kind of heavy on Central Ohio stuff. But like specific items, as far as manuscripts, we have some like organizational documents from different organizations. A lot of them are like student organizations and like their charters or their kind of like their meeting minutes. Those are super cool to like look through and just to see like what were people talking about, what was important, what were the issues that had people wanting to go out and protest, you know. And we have those from universities from all around the state. And it's cool to see that, like, even going back to like the 70s, there were student organizations that were coming together around queer identities and fighting for their rights and also building communities, which is super cool. So I really enjoy reading those like student docs. And it gives me like faith that, like, you know, young people, they're always the ones that are moving us forward and kind of like saving the day. It kind of has held true since at least the 70s, you know. That's what I've seen a lot. So those are documents that I really enjoy. We also have a lot of like newspapers and journals. Ohio has like an incredible number of queer publications, surprisingly. A lot of them, again, going back to the 70s. So there's like the Gay People's Chronicle, which was run out of out of Cleveland, and that was like a nationally recognized queer magazine or newspaper rather. There's like Gay Beat that was run out of Cincinnati. There's Outlook, which actually partnered with us in 2006 to start the GOHI collection. Awesome. They donated their print run of magazines to start that collection. There's so many. There's like dozens of them, and they're really amazing. And the cool thing about them is you get a real good snapshot of like what's going on in this time period. Because a lot of times there are like community events. There's like protests that are happening. There's like political stuff that is taking place. And the eerie thing is a lot of it is kind of like similar to what's happening now, and you're like, oh man, I thought we like solved this. So as far as like actual objects, we have a variety of stuff. We do have a lot of drag stuff, specifically drag king stuff, and a lot of that has had to do with working with the Friends of Summit Station and some of the stuff that they've donated. I love that stuff. I love bringing it out for programming. People really enjoy it and they take pictures with it. And maybe if we ever have a permanent exhibit, that would be part of that. There's also there's rifles, like a rifle from like the Flagets, which is like what do they call it?
Like a color guard?
It's a color guard, yeah. And they're at Columbus Pride, I think, most years. Yeah. So, we got a rifle from them. Rifle might be the wrong word because that implies it's a weapon, yeah. But it's a twirly thing. We got some flags, we've got some hats, some buttons. We have this really cool button from the 70s called Anita Eat My Oranges or something like that. It was from, what's her name? That lady that was like the orange juice lady who was really homophobic back in the 70s. This is totally like...
now I'm going to need to look this up.
I'm blanking, but people will know. People who know. I think Anita Brown was her name, okay. I want to say. And, she was really into like going around and proselytizing the anti-gay message. Huh. That was her hobby. Wow. But so there are a lot of really cool buttons in the collection. Just like basically anything. We have even some like bar signs from different gay bars that have been around. Kind of just like anything that documents the history of a place, an organization, an individual is, can be a historical object or depending on if it's a manuscript or an object. So, wow. Yeah, pretty much anything.
Is there any way for people, I know you said that there's not a exhibit yet, but is there any way for folks to see this or learn more about this specific collection?
Yeah. Absolutely. So great question. So as far as our manuscripts, they are accessible in our library. We have a reading room on the third floor of the Ohio History Center. It's at 800 East 17th Avenue here in Columbus, Ohio. And we now take walk-ins. I think it's open Wednesdays to Saturdays, I want to say. Definitely check the website. You can access that website from GOHI.org if you check it out. And so folks can come in, make a request for specific files. We do have like an archival system that you can like order specific boxes and files, and they're organized by collections. So you can, sit in the reading room and read those files. We allow pictures to be taken. As long as things are properly cited if you're doing research, so we just have an agreement for that. And as far as like the objects, that's kind of a little tougher right now because we're actually in the process of moving everything from our old storage facility to a new one that we are finishing, I believe, this summer. So it's going to be an entirely new building that is completely dedicated to storing and preserving our physical objects, including our GOHI collection. And once that is open to the public, I do believe that you can see that stuff by appointment as well. Okay. And we do bring out a lot of the objects for programming a few times a year. So yeah, if people are interested, they can definitely access at least the manuscripts right now, and then hopefully later objects as well. So again, GOHI.org is your hub for all of that stuff. We have a page that is just like research and resources. So awesome. It's all right there. Awesome. Yeah.
That's really cool. It's really making me think about like the stuff that I use day to day, or like the stuff that I write. Like I don't necessarily day-to-day think of myself as part of history, you know, like I'm not fighting a war, or I'm not like, I don't know, inventing something or whatever, you know, so I don't necessarily think of myself and my contributions as being something that may be in a museum someday. And I'm sure a lot of listeners are like, oh, I've got some stuff like collecting dust in my attic, you know.
Yeah.
How do you accept donations from people? Like, do you accept just whatever? What are you looking for?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We actually have an archivist and a curator, the archivist for manuscripts and the curators for objects, and they are the ones that I work with to do collections. So typically what we do is you can email gohi@ohiohistory.org, or you can head over to gohi.org and fill out the like, oh my gosh, what's it called when you like type in an email on the form, the web form. Yeah, you can head out over there, fill out the web form, and then I will connect you. I usually get those emails, so I'll connect you with either our archivist or our curator and have a meeting. Usually I try to attend those meetings as well to kind of be a liaison, because I'm really the one who's like working with the public and kind of connecting everyone, and I want to make sure folks are comfortable, since like I'm the one they started with. I want to be there for them for that entire process. And so we typically have a meeting and we look over the actual objects, they bring them in, and usually our archivist or curator will be able to say with some certainty whether or not something would fit into our collection. And then ultimately what I know is that they take them back and they have a vote amongst the entire curatorial team as to whether or not they would like to ascension something into the collection. I think that's the technical term.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of steps, but that makes sense, because that way you guys don't become like a thrift store, you know?
Right.
People are just bringing the contents of their home.
Right.
It actually has to be something.
Right. And we really like it if there's like continuity in terms of like, for example, if we bring someone in and we do a historical marker, we do an oral history, and then we also do collections, you know, and then you see the historical marker and you're like, oh man, I want to learn more about this. You head over to gohi.org, you watch the oral history, you're still like, oh man, I have to know more. And then you check out our GOHI collections, and maybe there are documents as well. So, you know, when it all works together like that, it's really beautiful. And I think that's like the best way to do it, is when you're able to kind of like have these different avenues for people to connect with history, whether it's a physical marker or an oral history or documents that people can actually research and you know, if they're doing a project. So
very cool.
Yeah.
You know, so we kind of talked about your favorite pieces in the collection, or you know, things that you've come across. What about like the people you've gotten to meet? Could you tell some of those stories? Like you talked about getting to meet some like older queer people, but like, you know, through your work in the community, what are some of the stories that have really left their mark on you?
Sure, for sure. So I'll tell you the first one. When I first started this job, so I've been in this job for a little over a year now, and so the first folks I met were the people who run the Ohio Lesbian Archives, and that's down in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Amazing collection. They started out collecting in the 70s and opened the museum, I want to say in 89, and it was open in the Crazy Ladies bookstore, which was a feminist bookstore in Cincinnati.
Oh my God.
So we're working, it's really cool. We're working on a historical marker to recognize the bookstore and the archive, and I've been able to connect with the owner or / co-founder of the archive. Her name's Phoebe Beiser, or Beiser. I always mispronounce her name. Phoebe Beiser. Yes, Phoebe, if you're listening, Phoebe Beiser. And yeah, she's amazing. She's been doing it since the 70s. And she told me like she went to New York and saw the Herstory archives and was really inspired and wanted to do something like that in Ohio, because it was, you know, so far away from New York. She wanted there to be a place in the Midwest that was centered on lesbian history, because she felt that lesbians were excluded from a lot of narratives. And she was not wrong about that. So the Ohio Lesbian Archives has become a really major place of historical preservation for not just lesbians, but the entire kind of like LGBTQ plus community. They do a lot of programming. They're very cool to work with. Fellow history people, so it's been a pleasure. I remember I was down there a while ago, kind of like doing some research to help them with their statement of significance for the application. And I remember saying like, oh, it would be great if there was like a lesbian green book so that we could make the case that Crazy Ladies was the only feminist bookstore. We can like put it in writing. And they went to the shelf and pulled out 2 different travel guides.
Oh.
And I was like, okay, so there clearly was like lesbian travel guides. I didn't even know that,
Something I learned recently, and this will show the other connection that I've had with Svetlana and the Gay Ohio History Initiative. I have been doing some work outside of my role at KYC, helping to preserve some lesbian queer history here in Ohio through a documentary that I've been working on to tell the story of Summit Station, which is the most recent marker that you mentioned earlier. And without getting into all of that, one of the places that we got to go to interview someone is actually up in Michigan.
Nice.
It was with the Lesbian Connection magazine. And this magazine is like the original like gossip forum. It is the original like
Nice.
I don't even know, like a group chat basically, long before group chats were a thing. And so this magazine, it's now in its 50th year. I'm pretty sure this year is its 50th year. And so 50 am I correct with that? I think 50 years.
Going back to the 70s.
That tracks. Yep, the 70s. And so people would use this as a way to connect with other people, hence the name Lesbian Connection.
Yeah.
So somebody would write something, it's all like reader curated, it's not like there's no staff writers.
Wow.
So somebody would write something and then somebody would respond the next month and then somebody else would respond.
Love
So it
it.
becomes this chat form,
my
but
goodness.
it's over the course of like months, right? And so the magazine is free to lesbians worldwide. They didn't, I signed up for it. They didn't card me for proof, you know what I mean?
You have a business card though.
Do you have,
I do have, yeah.
do you have your lesbian card?
But they do ask for donations from people who are able to
That's
pay.
cool.
Like they don't require that. So if like
Yeah.
you're a young person or somebody who's not able to afford it, like, and they send it to you in a manila envelope too. So it's like you don't get this thing.
very old
that
school.
says, yeah, Lesbian Connection. And like going to their space, they said, or like all of their subscriptions are like written on note cards all on the shelves. And so like the people I was with, they were able to go and see their subscription history of just like on the note card and like
Yeah.
their past addresses and stuff. But they wouldn't let us look at anybody else's contact information. And that's one of the things that I found so wild about this is like they have these contact dikes that they have. And so to your point about the green book or whatever, these contact dikes are folks who have said like, I'm here in Columbus and I would be, willing to have my name in a form of contact. So that might be their phone number, address, email address, social media, whatever. And so if somebody was coming to Columbus and needed a place to stay,
Love that.
you could crash on this contact dike's couch.
Yeah.
Or if you were thinking about moving to Columbus, you have someone to reach out to like, hey, is this a safe place to move? What are the best neighborhoods? Is there a bar that everyone goes to? Whatever. And so I just think about the trust because these people's contact information, especially when we think about like the 70s, 80s, whatever, that is like a whole lot of trust putting in the readers of this magazine to not use that contact information for evil, right?
Absolutely.
And to actually just use, but like that shows the necessity of that because it shows that like people genuinely, like they couldn't just go on Google and search like best LGBTQ neighborhoods in Columbus or wherever, you know what I mean? So that they had that as a resource. But like, again, that's like that history, that's that preservation. You go there and you can see like all the past issues and see what people were writing about, talking about, whatever. So that's just my shameless plug. It's only like loosely related to this conversation.
That's
If
super
you're
related.
interested, go to Lesbian Connection online and you can subscribe and be part of this group chat. Because you read it and it's like the vast majority of the readers are older. They have obituaries in there and sometimes it looks like the obituaries take up more space than the content itself. I'm like, I needed to lower the average age of the readers.
Right, it's lower than median age.
Yeah, you did your best. Well, I will say that, that is actually really relevant because that's how people connected before like the internet. And it wasn't easy and it required like you're taking a leap of faith, you're putting your info out there and you're hoping that it doesn't come back in some negative way, especially in like the 70s and 80s when potentially people were getting fired and evicted. I mean, that's still happening, unfortunately, and I don't believe we have a statewide law that that. Yeah, I don't believe we do, unfortunately, unless something happened recently.
No.
So that there's still many counties across Ohio where that could happen. The thing about the Manila folder was interesting because I'm not sure exactly when the law was changed, but there was a national law in the books that actually prevented certain things from being distributed in the mail that were seen as like sexual or like violent.
Was that something? And I watched the documentary Circus of Books, and I feel that was something with them and like transporting like any material. That's so interesting.
It's like anything that was a
court case,
right? Yes.
And I'm blanking on the name of that, but I know
Me too. Yeah.
In school, yeah.
So anything that was considered like an obscenity was not allowed to be mailed out. So the Manila folder was a way of trying to like get around that. And the fact that they're still doing it is kind of like an homage to that almost. As like someone who like knows about that, I'm like, oh, that's actually cool because, like technically we don't have to do that anymore, hopefully, but like I'm kind of glad that we still did.
Right.
And I think too, like just talking about, how you were saying earlier, like in the 70s, it seems to be like the youth that are like really, driving forward. But then you see like the history and these like elder queer folks like still doing the work.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, just seeing that community care, not only then, but like generationally, like, just hearing like, put my contact info, like if someone comes, like they can crash on my couch, like the community, like queer people are magic. The community that like,
absolutely,
we like, and risking that, in the 70s or whatever, like risking that to be like, it's hard to be a queer person and like, I've got space for you. Like, that is amazing to hear about.
It's like the original Airbnb, you know what I mean? And sometimes I think about like when I'm going to stay in an Airbnb, the amount of reading I do into the reviews to make sure I'm most likely not going to be murdered when I'm on vacation.
Yeah.
And for someone to just put their address out there and be like, come stay on my couch, I hope you want cats. You know what I mean? Like,
totally. And it does speak volumes to the work that people did to stay connected and build community. And I think that that's something that we should definitely recognize and celebrate. Sometimes I get a little like nostalgic for the era that I never lived in,
Yes, absolutely.
And it's because you just see these connections and these like physical spaces that aren't around anymore. And people had like a shared struggle and like, but they still also had these shared joys. And I think that it made for these really close-knit communities and these really safe spaces that were seen as almost sacred, which is why some of them are now getting historic markers because they really were so important to the queer community. And I do feel like now in our modern world, obviously there are a lot of more like visible queer people, which is amazing, but I do feel like we've lost a little of that community. And I do love seeing folks preserving that, whether it's through like community centers or historic preservation initiatives or, anything like that, that is like just basically at that grassroots level community building. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
A lot of the work that I've been doing with this documentary, I am like very much the youngest person in the room as these conversations are happening, like sometimes by decades. And like, I keep reflecting on what a cool thing that is to be able to hear these stories. But I like you said, I feel nostalgic for a time period that I wasn't alive for. And then I question myself because I'm like, well, is it fair for me to be nostalgic for this time that a lot of people are like grateful to be out of?
Right.
Because, things are in many ways better for queer and trans people, all things considered. And so I think too, some of these things that existed, like, lesbian connection that, still exists, but maybe not as robustly as it did. Queer bars, queer coffee shops, the need to have a queer person whose couch you can crash on because maybe you wouldn't be accepted in, every Airbnb or whatever. To me now, some of these things feel like novelties rather than necessities. I feel compelled to, go to these spaces, especially now that I've heard this story. But at the same time, it feels less like a necessity, like, oh, I have to go here because this is the only space where I'll be accepted, and more of a novelty of like, oh, this is cool, there's rainbows,
Yeah.
And then I grapple with that because I'm like, oh, by calling it this, like, I don't know, I don't even know what I'm getting at with this, but just like my general frustration that I wish as a 26-year-old lesbian, I wish that I had this space to go to. And I'm also glad that I can basically go wherever I want and be accepted, you know?
I think you can have both, honestly. Like, I think that both feelings are valid. I will say that, like, it's easy to become, like, complacent and think that history is always the story of progress, because thankfully that has been the case for most of our lives. But we always have to be vigilant and continue to be invested in our communities and be willing to fight for the rights that we've gained and continue fighting for additional rights. I do believe that that's really important. But at the same time, I think it's totally okay to be like, a little nostalgic, because there was a different sort of like community that in some ways was more interconnected and more dependent on each other. And I think, just in the modern world, whether you're queer or not, like, we're all a little bit more disconnected. And we feel like we are connected because we're on, like, social media all the time and we're always seeing stuff that's happening, but we're not necessarily spending a lot of time with, like, other people in a room connecting. So, I think that both are super valid.
Yeah. I was just, prior to us sitting down to record this, I was just at a class at OSU to talk for another KYC related thing. And we're sitting there before the class started, and everyone sits down and they're just on their phones. And I'm guilty of that too, but I'm looking around the room at all these people who, like, seem really cool and people who I'd want to be friends with in real life or whatever. And I was like, so how's everyone doing? Good. And then they're back to their phone, right?
Yeah.
And, like, there's a lot of online community, but, like, in these spaces that we have opportunity to be surrounded by potential, like, friends and community members, right? Like, I don't know, it makes me think about, like, what our social media presences will look like when documented as historical things.
I think about that a lot.
Possible, right? Because, if a bar is a space where these things happen, you could have the sign from the bar, and you could have the bar stools, and you can have a napkin or whatever, But, like, with social media, what happens if Instagram's not existent anymore, or TikTok?
Yeah.
Like, what does that look like in an archive?
I spend a lot of time thinking about what historical sources are going to look like in the future. Probably too much time, but it's totally a valid question, because some things are, like, archived and you can use, like, the Wayback Machine.
Sure.
And I have used that, actually, because I would consider things that happened 20 years ago history, but they are on the internet. Right. So, what are you going to do? So there are some, like, resources that allow you to, like, get at that stuff, but definitely not all. Like, I don't know that you can archive, like, Instagram posts, or I know that, like, Facebook events tend to remain unless they're deleted. So I've actually used those to help, like, build timelines before. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question when you're thinking about, like, historical sources in any sort of subject, whether it's queer or not, is like, how are we gonna tell this story of now in 20 or 30 years? Like, what is that gonna look like? And it's hard to have an answer, because we don't even know what the technology will look like in 20 or 30 years. So it's hard to know how we're going to preserve what we're doing now in the terms of history. So I never have any, like, clear answers, but it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about.
It's so interesting, just to, like, offshoot this, not to do with queer history, but history and individual research, as not a historian. But I'm a lover of the city of Buffalo. And
Don't say.
I know, it's all I talk about.
That's cool.
Every other sentence is
Never been.
Oh my gosh, you should totally go.
Yeah, I need to.
But I went to this, like, antique thrift store, and I got there was a photo for sale for $20 just of these punks in Buffalo. It was just a photo in black and white of these punks in Buffalo. And I am a lover of the kind of emo hardcore music, so I was like, started sobbing. I felt such a, like, deep connection to these people. Like, I don't know these folks, but, like, I was so, like, I need to know, like, who these people are. Like, it was a group of, like, 6 or 8, like, friends, just, like huge black, like, stud boots and leather jackets and grungy hair and, like, all of this. And I went to check out, and the lady that was checking me out first off was like, "Hi, how have you been?" Because I went there one time before on my other trip to Buffalo. And I was like, oh my gosh.
She remembers.
Yeah. But then she was telling me, she's like, "Oh my, brother like dated one of the girls. It's this band. It's this punk band. And then I got into all of this history.
Wow.
There is a Facebook page for Buffalo punk music in the 80s and still today. They have like a huge punk scene.
That's nuts.
And then one of the people in the photo, I did so much digging and like whatever. One of the people in the photo like sent me this long Facebook message, like DM.
way.
Yeah. And it was like, hey, that's me in this photo. Like Facebook's kind of weird. So like I figured I'd just message you, like whatever.
Yeah.
But like and I mean that was just a random one-off, like found this photo somewhere and like was able to like, now there's like this whole world, I guess, that like has just been uncovered
Very
for
cool.
me. Like
yeah, that kind of reminds me of the way that I've connected with some folks. So we do a lot of tabling, and we have something called the education collection that goes on the road with us for these events, and a lot of it is like duplicates of either like magazines, newspapers, photos, stuff like that, stuff that we like allow people to touch and read through. And so it's a chance for people to actually like touch the history and actually feel it, you know, get that sensory experience, which I think is like important, because a lot of times history feels really far away. But I digress. So we have a lot of photos from like, for example, there was a big March on Washington in 1979 that was organized by a lot of different LGBTQ organizations around the state. And so a lot of people are photographed in that, and we have several of those photos in our collection. And I've had folks at different events, it's just like, hey, I know that person. Like I was there.
So cool.
I've had people recognize themselves in our photos. And it's been really just amazing, because that'll be the beginning of like a half-hour conversation. And then sometimes it leads to like a collections meeting where they're like, I actually have like a whole box of documents about this if you want them, you know? So that's been actually a really cool way of connecting with people is actually those older photographs and stuff. Yeah,
So
it's always really cool when that happens.
yeah.
This is something I think about often, because my family, I mean, I take photos of everything and videos of everything, and I get that from my mom, who got that from her grandpa and whatever. Like we have so many photos, and a lot of them are on slides that, you know, my mom and I have been working on digitizing for years now, right? And in so many of these photos, you see people on vacation or whatever, you know what I mean? Like all these people in the background of this thing that you're trying to photograph. And I mean, that still happens today, right? But sometimes I think about how, like, you know, this picture of this kid in the background or whatever, like this old lady or whoever it is, what if their family has no pictures? Like, what if that family, like their house burned down, they lost all their pictures, and we happen to have this one picture of this person that maybe they would be just absolutely, I mean, like you, beside themselves to have, right?
Yeah.
And we just have it and we're like, oh yeah, whatever, I'm gonna toss this slide out. You know what I mean? It just really makes me think about how like any picture you take, and now it feels a lot more disposable, which is ironic because people would get disposable cameras, but like our pictures now, I'll go through my phone, I'm like, oh yeah, why do I need this? Delete.
Right.
Because it's not a physical thing that I'm getting rid of, you know? So I'm like, the pictures that I take now, are they gonna end up in an antique store 40 years from now?
Probably not.
Right.
Right.
Probably not.
But it makes you think about like the value in every single selfie you take or whatever, you know?
Well, and that was the thing, like the photo that I ended up spent $20 on buying, like there's the group of people and then there's like someone like running past in the photo. So it's not even like this like picture perfect, like, you know what I mean? But like
Almost makes it better.
I know.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Like there was just like life in it. And now it's framed in my living room and like, you know, but
Speaking of photos, I brought some postcards actually that have some photos from our collection. I believe that they were all in Columbus. This one it's got Silence Equals Death, and that is from ACT UP. So there was a local chapter here in Columbus. We've got one here. I believe this says lesbian gay people demand justice. Here, I believe this was from a 1980s protest because HIV/AIDS was not being recognized by the dispatch at that time. And then we've got one from a pride parade here in Columbus as well. So, you know, I love the photos in our collection. I think that they are like the most accessible thing for folks in terms of just like, here's a historical thing that happened. You don't have to read it. You can just check it out, look at it. And it tells you so much just from one photo. I've always been really, really into like visual sources, whether they're pictures or like videos, as historical sources. In my dissertation, I actually have a whole chapter that's just about movies and television. So, you know, I love like visual representations of history, even more than documents. Documents are great, but videos and pictures are fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like going through working on this documentary project, there have been so many photos that have been provided to us, but also videos, because a lot of the people who we've talked to, like even prior to having cell phones with video cameras, you know, like they were documenting things constantly. I'm just imagining them lugging around this like enormous video record, you know, a camcorder or whatever, like over their shoulder, whatever it was. And like going through these, I'm like, you get so much more of the story just from those videos of like people dancing. Like somebody thought to set up a camera and a tripod and record like 2 hours of people dancing at this bar. I could watch all 2 hours of that without getting bored. I wouldn't even think to look at my phone because I just am captivated by this video of people dancing.
Cool.
I'm sure as people were dancing that night, the last thing they thought about was, oh, I'm being part of history. They were just, you know, trying to dance and have a good time, right?
For sure.
And thinking about things that way, it really gives some perspective to like everything you do day to day and how that will have a lasting impact on like future generations. It's so meta.
I think we'll definitely have an abundance of like AV stuff in the future. You know, it's hard to even like think about like what history is going to look like in the future, because like sometimes I worry that the future is bleak, but hopefully we'll still like be in a civilized world where like we can focus on history and we're not just scrounging for food. That's just the cynic in me there. But yeah, you know, bringing it back to GOHI, we actually on our GOHI website have a page that's just dedicated to AV sources. We currently have 27 modernized oral histories that we've done in the last 5 years. And then before that, we have a very big collection of stuff from the last 20 years or so that was recorded by some different folks and donated to us, which we've gotten digitized in the last year or so. And then we have something called the Vault. And in the Vault is all of the like non-oral history stuff. So we have some like, there was something called the Gay News that was run by Stonewall, and they, you know, we have some of those. We have some roundtables that we hosted when we were a young organization, probably like 2007, 8, and you know, those are really cool because not only are those folks talking about their history, but now that video of their roundtable is a piece of history in itself. So it's kind of like meta. It's like the inception of history, you know, like you're like peeling back the layers. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, so that's at gohi.org. I will say it again.
That's awesome.
Plugging it.
One last question that I have, I don't know if you have anything else, Dee, but one last question I have is more of a fun question.
Sure.
I know, you know, you already talked about what you did your dissertation on, so maybe that was one area of history around queer people that you really dove deeply into. But if there was any time in history that you could go back to and just learn more about the queer people during that time, I mean, we could talk about like dinosaurs all the way up until now or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because queer people have always existed, as we've said, as we all know.
Yeah.
Like, what is the one period in history that you would like to learn more about?
So I'm gonna not be terribly original, and I think most historians would say the same thing as me. Is probably like the 1920s, especially in like Paris or Berlin, kind of like pre-Nazis. They kind of ruined it for everybody, but you know, there were actually really robust queer communities in places like Paris and Berlin and some other European cities, and also in like Chicago and New York. That were really like exciting and budding, and there was a lot of cultural production taking place, a lot of dancing, a lot of just community, and you know, I would love to learn more about that for sure. It's something I've learned. I've studied World War II and like the oppression that took place, and I've read a lot about how those communities were basically disassembled, and those people were persecuted, and many of them unfortunately were killed, especially in Germany. But I haven't actually read very much about the communities themselves. So that's something that I would like to learn more about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? You ever given any thought to this?
I was just like, I had no idea that any of that was happening in the 1920s. And so now, like, and I'm looking at these photos and I'm like, okay, so who is this? Like, I'm going down a rabbit hole.
There's no metadata on these postcards.
I was wondering.
Something we're gonna definitely address in future printings.
I'm just so interested. But what time period, I want to go back to learn about queer folks specifically. I don't know. I guess, like, I know a little bit about, like, ancient, like, Greece or whatever, and that, like, gay men were, that was like I don't know if normal is the right word, but, like, that was not so heavily, like, you know, persecuted or, like, looked down upon. It was different for lesbians than it was for gay men, but, like, I feel like I know that. I don't know. I want to pick, like, a random, like, what was happening in, like, 1825. You know, 1825, somewhere in the middle of, like, Pennsylvania. Like, what was going on?
Right.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely examples of queer history from all periods, especially, like, in the Western world. That's been pretty well documented. Less so in, like, I would say in the non-Western world, just because of, like, access to records and stuff, and also, like, historical imperatives and, like, what stories are kind of, like, being told. But if you're interested in that, I bet you, if you did a quick Google, you could find some stuff.
I know. Yeah. I was waiting for you to be like, well, actually, in 1825 in Pennsylvania.
I can't tell you. No, I'm not. You know, I'm really more of a modernist. Like, I've always been really intrigued by 20th century history because the 20th century was just, like, such a transformative time in so many ways for everyone, and queer people especially. So, you know, you have Stonewall basically, and then that was, like, a huge game changer because it gave us all, like, a shared language and this idea of gay liberation. So, I think that's always been really intriguing to me. So I do need to definitely learn more about, like, the pre-modern stuff. But again, it's, like, harder. There's fewer documents. And there's also the question of, like, if people weren't calling themselves gay or trans or queer, like, but they were doing things that we would identify as queer, there's always, like, the challenge of interpretation.
Yeah, I remember I was, like, looking up, like, just, like, general, like, queer history from, like, way back when, and there's, like, this ancient Egyptian tomb, and it's two men together.
I was going to say that is the period of time that I want to learn more about.
Well, and people are like, were they brothers? Were they really good friends? Were they, like, whatever? You know what I mean? But, like
best friends.
Right, just best buds. But, like, go. You can talk more about that, Mallory.
Oh, you pretty much said everything that I was going to say. I'm just very intrigued about that.
Yeah, it's a whole, it's definitely, like, a whole thing, and it's something that has come into my work with the historical markers. We've got a couple of the markers that are, like, 19th century markers, and, you know, the idea is that, like, these folks were definitely, like, breaking gender norms and conventions. The one specifically that we're working on was a lady in the 19th century that was, like, an artist and hung out with, like, exclusively queer women who identified as lesbians. And although this particular person never, like, openly said they were a lesbian, they never married. They only hung out with these lesbians. They wore men's clothes and were pictured doing it proudly. So, you know, the idea is, like, how do we interpret this without putting words in anyone's mouth, really? And so I think that what you can do is you can kind of, like, deprioritize the labels and talk more about, like, this person was breaking gender norms. This person was breaking norms around, like, marriage and like, family and domesticity. And, like, that kind of allows for a lot more flexibility in the conversation when we kind of deprioritize, like, was the person gay? You know, like,
right.
That's like a really black and white thing.
Right.
So.
Like, were they queering gender? Were they queering our understanding of, like,
And I think that's what I do is, like, I tend to be like, they were living queerly. So I think that we can interpret them in that lens.
Yeah.
So.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, every case is, like, requires its own nuance. It's a fun job for sure. And I think that, like, initially there's always, like, that hesitation, like, oh, I don't want to label someone queer if they weren't. But it's not so much whether or not they were queer. It's more about, like, the context of the time and, like, what they were doing and the implications of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And queer, I mean, the great thing about that word, that label, is how expansive it is.
I do love the Q word.
Yeah.
In my dissertation, I refer to refer to the historical people or the actors as queer. And I basically was like, this is a great catch-all.
Well, Svetlana, this has been a tremendous conversation, and I know that we could continue talking for the rest of history about all of this, but I just want to thank you for being on the podcast and hopefully inspiring others to not only check out GOHI and, you know, the Ohio History Connection and all the collections that are available, but to see maybe like their own day-to-day life as something that is contributing to history too. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I do feel like it's super important for people to see their own identities reflected in history, because a lot of times it's that narrative of like important white guys, right? Like, and that's not all history is. It's not even like remotely what history is. So, yeah, thank you to you guys for what you do here at KYC. And one last plug, if you are interested in learning more about Ohio's queer history, check out www.gohi.org.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great to talk to you.
Thank you.